Have you ever had that persistent feeling that something about you never quite fit, but you couldn't put your finger on exactly what? Perhaps you spent years believing you were too sensitive, too intense, or simply too much, and the world around you seemed to confirm it at every turn. If any of that sounds familiar, what you're about to discover here could be one of the most important pieces of information that has ever reached you. Because there is a very concrete reason why so many autistic women reach adulthood without ever having received a diagnosis, and it has far less to do with them than with the systems that should have identified them in the first place. Autism in women is invisible by design. Not because it doesn't exist, but because for decades nobody knew or cared to see it. Our neurodivergent women learned from an early age to camouflage themselves, to mimic, to smile at the right moment, and to swallow their overwhelm in silence. And they did it so well that they fooled everyone around them, including themselves. In this video, you're going to understand exactly how that process unfolds, why a late autism diagnosis is so common in women, and what lies beneath behaviors that the world has always called something else entirely. Brace yourself, some of this information is going to make pieces that never quite fitted finally fall into place. Growing up, autistic women tend to carry labels that have nothing to do with what is actually happening inside them. She's shy. She's too sensitive. She's so emotional. Those words stick like glue, and while they might seem harmless enough, they quietly delay a late autism diagnosis that could change everything. Research shows that girls receive their diagnosis an average of 2 years later than boys, and those 2 years make an enormous difference in someone's life. And do you know the detail that most people miss? When a boy struggles socially, the adults around him ask why. When a girl goes through exactly the same thing, they assume they already know the answer. Neurodivergent women spend years being misread by the very people who should understand them: teachers, parents, doctors. If you've ever been told you were too dramatic or far too sensitive without anyone stopping to properly investigate, know this: that wasn't just the way you were. That was a pattern that deserved attention, and it still does. Imagine trying to concentrate in a meeting whilst a fluorescent light seems to scream at your eyes. The label inside your blouse scratches like sandpaper, and the hum of the air conditioning takes up half your brain. For autistic women, that isn't an exceptional situation, it's a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. This constant sensory overload is real, measurable, and utterly exhausting. Yet for years it was dismissed as fussiness, drama, or difficult behavior by people who never had to carry that weight themselves. The trouble is that when a child complains that their clothes are uncomfortable, or that the school canteen is too loud, it's rarely connected to autism in women, especially if she's bright, articulate, and appears to be coping perfectly well. Sensory sensitivity ignored in childhood becomes anxiety in adolescence, and chronic exhaustion in adulthood. And the most ironic part? Many neurodivergent women spend decades believing they are weak, when in reality they were simply surviving in a world that was never calibrated for them. If you've ever caught yourself twirling your hair without realizing, chewing the end of your pen during a meeting, or making quiet patterns with your tongue whilst trying to concentrate, you may never have imagined that there is a name for that and a meaning behind it. Stimming is the way a neurodivergent brain regulates itself in a world of overwhelming stimulation. And in autistic women, it appears in such subtle forms that it goes completely unnoticed. Whilst male stims tend to be more visible rocking, making repetitive sounds, female stims hide themselves in socially acceptable gestures. And that is precisely where the problem lies. Because these behaviors appear normal to the outside observer, nobody makes the connection with autism masking or any neurodivergent pattern. The girl who twirls her hair is nervous. The one who chews her pen is anxious. The one who taps patterns with her fingers is distracted. None of those explanations is wrong, but all of them are incomplete. Beneath each of those quiet little gestures, there may be a nervous system working overtime just to keep everything functioning. And that, as you're about to see, comes at an enormous cost. There's a scene that many neurodivergent women know all too well. The world has become too big. The stimulation has passed its limit, and the body simply shuts down. It isn't a tantrum. It isn't manipulation. It isn't hormones. It's a shutdown, a very real neurological response to an overload that was ignored for far too long. But because in autistic women this process rarely comes with shouting or agitation, it is almost always misread as a bad mood, emotional fussiness, or that tired old classic, it must be hormonal. The quiet crying in the bathroom, the sudden withdrawal after a social event, the inability to reply to messages for days on end. All of this can be a sign of an autistic crisis, that was never recognized as such. And when a woman spends years having her meltdowns and shutdowns treated as emotional weakness, she learns to conceal them even more effectively. The result? On the outside, she seems fine. On the inside, she is at breaking point. This enormous effort to appear normal even has a name, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about now. Imagine spending every single second of your day studying the people around you as though you were an actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. How did she smile? How did he respond to that question? What's the right tone for this situation? For autistic women, that isn't an exaggeration, it's a daily routine. Autism masking is this sophisticated social camouflage that many develop from childhood, imitating expressions, behaviors, and even other people's interests, just to fit into a world that never felt particularly intuitive. On the outside, they seem well-adjusted. On the inside, they are exhausted in a way that is difficult even to put into words. The problem is that masking works far too well. So well, in fact, that it deceives family, friends, teachers, and very often the woman herself, who spends years believing she learned how to be social without realizing she was simply performing. Neurodivergent women who master this form of camouflage often arrive at adulthood with a persistent feeling that they are imposters, that at any moment, someone is going to find out they aren't who they appear to be. And it's no wonder they really were being someone they were not. The exhaustion that comes from this performance has a clinical name, and its consequences show up in ways that very few people associate with autism in women. If there is one trait that slips by unnoticed as a sign of autism in women, it is precisely the one the world tends to praise: perfectionism and an endless need to please. It looks like virtue. It looks like dedication. It looks like maturity. But beneath that flawless surface, many neurodivergent women are using control and approval as anchors in a world that feels far too unpredictable. When everything around you seems chaotic and impossible to decipher, being the perfect student, the impeccable employee, or the friend who is always available becomes a survival strategy, not a conscious choice. And that is exactly why this pattern remains so invisible. A girl who gets top marks, never causes trouble, and always does everything right, doesn't raise any red flags, she gets praised. Nobody stops to ask why she needs other people's approval so desperately, why any mistake completely destabilizes her, or why she rehearses conversations in her head before she has them. Perfectionism becomes a mask within a mask, concealing very real difficulties behind a performance of competence. And when that system finally collapses, because it always does, what surfaces tends to be mistaken for something else entirely. There is a quiet trap that ensnares many autistic women, and it carries a rather ironic name: being too intelligent to receive help. When a girl gets excellent grades, solves problems with ease, and impresses teachers with her ability to absorb new material, nobody imagines she might be struggling. The reasoning is almost automatic: if she were autistic, she'd be having difficulties. But what very few people understand is that a high IQ doesn't erase the challenges of autism in women. It simply disguises them beneath a brilliant layer of academic results. Beneath the top marks and the glowing praise, these neurodivergent women are frequently operating at their absolute limit, studying 3 times as hard to compensate for difficulties that nobody sees, memorizing social rules as though revising for an exam, and collapsing at home after a day that seemed great to everyone else. Academic success becomes yet more evidence that she's doing fine, when in reality, it is just another form of autism masking that went unquestioned throughout an entire lifetime. And when this compensatory strategy reaches its limits, usually in adulthood, when social demands increase, what emerges tends to receive a diagnosis that has nothing to do with autism: generalized anxiety disorder, recurrent depression, borderline personality disorder. If you are a neurodivergent woman, there's a considerable chance that one or more of these diagnoses have appeared in your life before autism was ever mentioned. And it isn't a coincidence, it is a pattern so consistent that researchers have documented it extensively. The trouble is that these mental health diagnoses treat the symptoms without ever getting close to the root cause. It's rather like taking paracetamol for a headache without ever discovering there's a tumor. The pain eases for a while, but whatever caused it all is still there. A late autism diagnosis in women frequently arrives only after years of therapy, medications, and that persistent feeling that something still doesn't quite fit. Many women report that when they finally received the correct diagnosis, their first reaction was relief, not despair. Because suddenly, decades of confusing experiences, Difficult relationships and inexplicable bouts of exhaustion finally made sense. Autism isn't an addition to these women's stories, it is the thread that was always running through them, only it had never been seen by its proper name. And understanding why that happens requires looking at something even more structural than individual diagnoses. Here is a fact that deserves to be far better known than it is. The vast majority of autism research was conducted for decades, using predominantly male samples. This means that the criteria clinicians use to this day to identify autism were built on a profile that does not reflect the reality of autistic women. It's rather like designing a vision test, using only people with blue eyes, and then administering it to everyone. The results will systematically fail anyone who doesn't fit the original mold. The real-world impact of this is enormous. When a neurodivergent woman walks into a consultation, she frequently doesn't look autistic to a clinician trained in traditional stereotypes, because those stereotypes were shaped by male behavior. She maintains eye contact, she can hold a conversation, she displays apparent empathy and a reasonable social history. What the clinician doesn't see is the mental rehearsal that took place before the appointment, the exhaustion that follows it, and the decades of autism masking that made all of it possible. Changing this landscape begins with understanding that autism in women overlaps with other conditions in ways that complicate diagnosis even further, and that is exactly what we're going to explore now. If there is one combination that confounds even the most experienced clinicians, it is autism and ADHD in the same person, especially when that person is a woman. The ADHD diagnosis tends to come first, partly because its signs are somewhat more visible and better recognized. But while all the attention goes to the inattentiveness, the impulsivity, and the difficulty with organization, the autism remains hidden between the lines, unidentified and untreated. Women with both autism and ADHD live in a kind of blind spot within the healthcare system, too present to be overlooked, too complex to fit into a single diagnosis. And what makes all of this even more challenging is that the two conditions intertwine in ways that can amplify the difficulties of each. ADHD makes it harder to use the compensatory strategies that autistic women typically develop, whilst autism adds layers of sensory and social overload that conventional ADHD treatment simply doesn't reach. Neurodivergent women with this combination frequently report that no single treatment ever seems to fully resolve things, because no single treatment was ever looking at the whole picture. Understanding this overlap isn't just important for diagnosis. It is the first step towards finally receiving the support that was always needed. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this content resonated in a way that goes beyond simple curiosity. Perhaps you recognized yourself in one of the patterns described: the exhausting perfectionism, the autism masking that drains your energy without anyone noticing, the diagnoses that treated the symptoms but never reached the root. Or perhaps you're thinking of a woman you know, a daughter, a friend, a patient, and the pieces are finally beginning to fall into place. Either way, that recognition is already a huge step forward, because you cannot seek answers to questions that have never been asked. It's worth pausing for a moment now and asking yourself how many women around you might be carrying this weight without knowing its name. How many stories of she's far too sensitive or she's just being dramatic might be concealing a late autism diagnosis that would change everything. And more importantly, what are you going to do with what you've learned today? Knowledge without action is just information. But knowledge applied has the power to transform entire life stories, yours or someone you love. Neurodivergent women deserve to be seen, understood, and supported with the precision that has always been denied to them. And that begins with people who are willing to look beyond the stereotypes. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there is still so much more to be said about autism in women, autism and ADHD, and the experience of neurodivergent women, and you won't want to miss a single one of the upcoming videos.